With it being the month of horror and spooky festivities, I decided this would be the best time to fully dive into the horror genre, my favorite genre in any form of media, might I add, and I came across a manga called PTSD Radio, a collection of uncanny horror stories. Much like any Junji Ito manga I've read, this manga has a real nice way of making you feel creeped the fuck out. The author Nakayama Masaki holds nothing back when illustrating and telling these stories, using heavily detailed panels or making the characters create the oddest facial expressions. The manga quite literally lacks nothing when it comes to the horror. Now, it'd be damn near impossible to explain this story in one continuous storyline because while all of the stories are connected in some way, shape, or form through past or present, the storylines jump around way too much for it to make sense in a video format. Nakayama utilizes this story format to the fullest extent by creating a very tense atmosphere, and the second you get to the juicy parts, it swaps to a different storyline, leaving the reader confused but also much more interested about what's really going on in this story. Each chapter follows a different character in a different time period, but all with one thing in common: the supernatural. The series' first volume would release in 2010 and the last and final volume would release in 2018, with it coming to an abrupt ending because, well, Nakayama was starting to believe that he was cursed or being haunted because many things that were unexplainable started to happen in his life, similar to the things that were happening in his manga, which would cause him to end his series prematurely, leaving many fans confused. Now, from volumes 1 through 4, Nakayama would strictly focus on the story, but in volume 5 is when things take a little turn and they get creepier. At the end of volume 5, he would add this story called The True Edition Aftermath, a story about the various mysteries that occurred after he came home and his office's home shrine was broken. He would state how he discovered a piece of purposely broken home shrine in the closet of his office a few years ago, and he couldn't say whether or not him finding this had anything to do with the strange events that happened afterwards, but after finding this, a lot of strange things began to happen to him, like contracting a near deadly blood disease of unknown origin. He would add a small editor's note that said, "Due to various reasons following the publication of the previous chapter, I will refrain from sharing any more of my experiences for the time being." And the reason for that is, after he drew those chapters, more baffling things began to happen to him and it left him spooked. He would begin to illustrate the strange things that began to happen to him, like a talisman that had been stuck securely to the ceiling suddenly peeled off and fell on the table, and on the same day, right before he had to go to an event that had already been scheduled, all of the clocks in his room seemed to go haywire or just freeze or flicker. He would talk about a time that he went out drinking one night with a local horror storyteller, and after telling him all of the strange things that have been happening to him recently, a bunch of bad stuff would begin to occur. Shohei, the horror storyteller, the very next day would come down with a high fever, and then a few days after that, the back wheel of his bike would get wrecked while he was riding down the street, and then on top of that, a few days later, he would apparently break his arm. So either this man was on the worst luck streak of all time, or somebody cursed him. He was on the phone with his editor one night, and his editor is telling him that he should turn these things that actually happened to him into a story. Now, at first, Nakayama is against this idea because he doesn't want to revisit any of these experiences, but he eventually warms up to the idea due to his editor trying to convince him, and while they're on the phone talking, suddenly a water droplet hits him in his arm, and he looks up and there's no sign of any water leaking anywhere. He's very confused at this point because not only is there no sign of any water leak, he's on the 6th floor and nobody lives above him. He tries to brush it off and continue the conversation on the phone when suddenly another water droplet hits him, and that's where the story ends. Now, he adds a few more editor's notes saying, "You might wonder why I've decided to break the silence, and the reason is because there's something I must absolutely confirm." He started to notice that some people remember the contents of these stories as clear as day, while others vaguely remember them no matter how many times they're reminded. And for some of them, the closer they got to the heart of the matter, the less they remember, which he states isn't really a problem, but for those who do remember, they usually end up getting hurt or ill, or in some cases, they fall off the face of the earth. He's had numerous assistants quit on him and he's never heard from them ever again. And then he puts a warning for the following story, which I hope I didn't curse myself by reading this, but it says, "The story from this point on should not be contagious. Even so, I advise you read at your own discretion." The first floor of his office building had been vacant for years, but it was giving off this stench that you could smell as soon as you walked in. The stench was so bad that it started attracting bugs to the entrance, so one day he decides to go look at it and tries opening the door and finds out it's unlocked, and he would tell his assistant, who would then go look at the room himself, and he would see that the floor was missing tiles, but you see, this was on the first floor and the building had no basement. He would tell his other assistant about the vacant room on the first floor, and she would get curious and go to check it out for herself, but they would never see her again or hear from her again after that. He would experience more weird things that were similar to his manga, like a crow staring at him from outside of his window with the beak peeking through his window, which would be impossible because his window had a guardrail on it, and the window was also completely closed. His assistants would begin to see things standing outside of the office, and suddenly either all of them would stop coming or they would fall ill. But what they all had in common was they saw some sort of black thing. Nakayama planned to never talk about this ever again unless something strange happened to him again, and at the end of volume 6, his last and final chapter, we got another more true horror stories. While he was working on volume 5, suddenly the left side of his face began to swell up and he had no idea why. He began to remember a note he had left at the back of his book in one of the volumes saying, "This will probably be the last time I speak on this topic. That said, if any new details surface that shed some light on the series of events or suggest that the whole thing was in my head, I'll consider revealing the full story somewhere down the line." He crumbles up the piece of paper and realizes he can now talk again, and he feels no more pain in the left side of his face. He went to the hospital the next day, but they couldn't find anything wrong with him, so he begins thinking to himself, in other words, something was trying to tell me, don't tell anyone. We won't allow you to say any more. I'm getting the heebie-jeebies just by talking about this. I honestly don't remember it being this creepy the first time I read it. Now, whether you believe these stories or you think it was just a way for him to get out of making the manga anymore, it doesn't explain some of the stories about how his assistants leave him after seeing strange things, or other people being able to remember these stories while others are unable to recall any of these events that happened. One thing's for sure, something creepy was definitely going on around the time when he was making this manga, and I just hope none of that rubbed off on me from reading this. This manga needs to be drowned in holy water 100 times and then 100 times more just to make sure there's nothing evil going on with it. Now, I know there are some cases where people can be so heavily involved in something, in this case a horror manga, that maybe they start to see the things that they're talking about or they start hallucinating, but it doesn't explain other people being able to see that or having assistants quit on you and then never hearing from them again. Now, even though I just explained everything strange that happened to the author, I do recommend this series if you're interested in horror manga. No, I'm not trying to curse y'all, but if I read it and got cursed, then y'all are going down with me. But that's all I have for today's video. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. I'll catch you on the next video. Peace.